Coming up on the Nexus, President Trump's controversial speech at the UN General Assembly.
All I got from the United Nations was an escalator that on the way up stopped right in the middle, and then a teleprompter that didn't work. These are the two things I got from the United Nations.
Plus, the United States stops the Palestinian leader from attending. But why?
Another aggressive act against Palestinians.
And finally, do you know who I am? The French president encounters New York's finest.
Croissant. If you don't see it, let me cross. I negotiate with you.
Hello and welcome to the Nexus. The United Nations General Assembly always provides moments of dark comedy and drama, and this year, the UN's 80th year, has been no exception. We'll be looking at the most interesting bits in a moment, and we'll be debating whether or not the UN as we know it should be scrapped.
It really does need to be rethought and reimagined.
It remains really the only true universal institution that we have.
It is a body based on the balance of power in 1945, and the world has moved on.
Right, more from them in a moment, but first, here are some of the highlights from the 80th UN General Assembly.
I have ended 7 unendable wars. They said they were unendable. You're never going to get them solved. It's too bad that I had to do these things instead of the United Nations doing them. And sadly, in all cases, the United Nations did not even try to help in any of them. I ended 7 wars, dealt with the leaders of each and every one of these countries, and never even received a phone call from the United Nations offering to help in finalizing the deal.
Le temps est venu. C'est pourquoi, fidèle à l'engagement historique de mon pays au Proche-Orient, pour la paix entre le peuple israélien et le peuple palestinien, je déclare que la France reconnaît aujourd'hui l'État de Palestine.
The State of Palestine is the only entity eligible to assume full responsibility for governance and security in Gaza. And to our patient Palestinian people in their homeland and everywhere, I'd like to tell you the dawn of freedom and liberty is coming, no doubt.
Biz güçlünün haklı olduğu değil, haklının güçlü olduğu bir sistem kurulana kadar dünya 5'ten büyüktür demeye devam edeceğiz. Daha adil bir dünya mümkündür.
Your countries are being ruined. The United Nations is funding an assault on Western countries and their borders. The UN is supposed to stop invasions, not create them and not finance them. It's time to end the failed experiment of open borders. You have to end it now. See, I can tell you, I'm really good at this stuff. Your countries are going to hell.
Okay, let's bring in our first guest. Then we have Richard Gowan, the UN Director for the International Crisis Group. Welcome to the programme, Richard. We've just heard President Donald Trump giving an account of his peacekeeping efforts around the world, and he clearly finds that he is more effective than the United Nations. What do you make of that?
Well, it is in fact true that President Trump has been involved in more peace deals this year than the United Nations Security Council has been. But one of the reasons is that the US has been keeping the UN at arm's length. President Trump hadn't even spoken to Secretary General Guterres until yesterday, and whenever the Security Council has tried to call for a ceasefire in Gaza, the US has vetoed the resolution. So actually, one reason that the UN is underperforming is that the US is keeping it down.
Well, he actually complains that they don't get in touch with him.
I think that's slightly the wrong way round. UN officials have been desperate to get a better line to the Trump administration, but there hasn't even been a fully fledged US ambassador in New York until just a few days ago. Guterres wasn't even able to speak to Secretary of State Marco Rubio. The US has been ghosting the UN, so I think that if Trump had called for help, he would have been offered help.
Now, the Trump administration made the decision not to issue visas to the Palestinian delegation, and that has caused a lot of people to wonder if the United States is a fit location to host the United Nations. The United States said it was because of security concerns. Others are very skeptical. They think it's a political move.
It is clearly a political move. It was an effort to reduce the symbolic impact of a number of countries like France and Britain formally recognizing Palestine during this General Assembly session. And I do think people are saying, if the US is going to pick and choose who can come to UN meetings, then maybe the UN should meet elsewhere. The General Assembly did meet in Geneva in the past, and you could also have UN meetings in places like Nairobi, rather than everything having to happen in the United States.
You'll notice that many leaders, President Trump, President Erdogan, the UN Secretary General, they all agree that the United Nations needs reforming, but for different reasons. Can we take a quick look at how the UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council in particular operate? And then I want to come back to you for a quick question.
The towering 39-floor story Secretariat building was designed to symbolise a new era of peace and cooperation after the devastation of World War II. Since the UN's formation, every September, world leaders have gathered in its halls for the annual General Assembly. So what do they achieve from this ivory tower? Part pageantry, part politics, every leader gets their 15 minutes of fame at the iconic marble podium. It gives everyone the chance to air their grievances on the world stage on a subject of their choosing.
A natural disaster in Moscow decided to launch a big war and kill tens of thousands of people.
The UN was sold as a model of democracy, with every country getting one vote. So you get the same say whether you're giant China or tiny Nauru, the smallest of the 193 member states with a population of 13,000. Palestine and the Holy See hold observer status. They can speak but not vote. But having a platform means nothing without a visa.
The Palestinian delegation of around 80 people who were aiming to attend this month's annual UN General Assembly have all had their visas revoked or simply denied. The US is accusing the Palestinian delegation of undermining peace efforts with Israel.
The reality is, the Assembly's resolutions are mostly symbolic. The only thing they really control is their own budget, which has fallen this year to $3.72 billion, a result of President Trump slashing US contributions.
The UN has tremendous potential. It's not living up to that potential right now. It really isn't, hasn't for a long time.
Most of the time, General Assembly resolutions are non-binding. The really important decisions must go through the UN Security Council, which has the power to overrule even the General Assembly. This exclusive body has just 15 members. 10 of them are voted in by the General Assembly on a rotating basis. The other 5 form an even more exclusive club. America, Britain, France, China and Russia, who all took their permanent seats as they shaped the UN following the aftermath of the Second World War. Even today, they kind of run the show, with each permanent member having the power to veto a resolution. Other countries are becoming increasingly fed up with the status quo, arguing that other nations should also get the chance to sit as permanent members.
Well, given all of that, Richard, do you think the United Nations does need reforming, and if so, how?
I think that everyone, including, in fact, the 5 permanent members of the Council, would admit that the UN does need reform. It is a body based on the balance of power in 1945, and the world has moved on. I think the challenge is that while everyone agrees that reform is necessary, there is no agreement on what reform should look like. So countries like India and Brazil say that they should have permanent seats with vetoes in the Security Council. A lot of other countries don't agree, and China in particular is not keen to have India sitting as an equal at the UN. Getting any reform to the Security Council means reforming the UN Charter, and that needs 2/3 of the world's nations to ratify any change. So unfortunately, I think we're stuck with the UN we have.
That's very interesting, because this institutional inertia is usually blamed straight away on the United States and on Britain and on France. But actually, other countries, developing nations and so on, they have their own reasons for keeping out the others. Who do you think is the most deserving of, to have that seat on the council? And if it's, for example, the continent of Africa, would it be rotating? What possibility can you come up with?
Look, there are many different models, and there are also models for reform which don't involve creating new permanent seats, but instead involve creating some seats where countries would be present for 5 or 10 years, rather than just 2 as elected members. So you can think of that as premium economy, somewhere between first class and economy class. I think that there is general agreement amongst most members that Africa deserves greater representation. And if the African Union were coherent enough and organized enough to have a seat of its own, then that is a possibility. I mean, I would say it's very hard to make a case that India, the world's most populous nation, shouldn't have a greater role in the UN Security Council. But as I say, countries like China and Pakistan are not so keen on that.
Richard Gowan, thank you so much for your analysis today. Much appreciated. Now, coming up in the programme, we take a look at some of the lighter and more bizarre moments at the United Nations.
How are you? Guess what? I'm waiting in the street because everything is frozen for you.
OK, let's bring in our next guest now, Hannah Ryder, a former UN advisor on China and trade. Hannah, welcome to the programme. So we've just heard there from our previous guest that China has reservations about expanding the UN Security Council. Why is that?
As you know, China is a member of the P5, so it has a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. And of course, from a national interest perspective, diluting that kind of power is something no P5 member is going to be interested in. However, where cases have been made, so for example, African countries have been pushing China and others to take its own view on reform of the UN Security Council. And so China has shown some willingness in that context, but with some other great powers like India, for example, the case from a Chinese perspective doesn't seem to be as strong.
Hannah, of course, Africa's population is fast growing and it's an entire continent. Some are arguing that Africa needs representation on the UN Security Council. How would that work, and do you agree?
Yeah, well, this has actually been a proposal since 2005. It's called the Eswini and Sirte Declaration and Consensus. And the idea is that there would be 2 African seats on the P5, so it would expand to be a P7. And the African countries would determine themselves how the seats would be taken, either through some kind of rotation or through, for example, how the AU at the moment is on the G20. You have a permanent seat for the African Union Commission, who is like the European Commission and does a lot of work in terms of support to member states. And then you would have a rotating presidency every year for whoever is the AU president, and they would take the other seat. So right now, for example, that is Angola.
There's quite a bit of talk about how bigger nations influence the smaller nations when it comes to voting. When it comes to China and with smaller African countries with which it has quite a lot of business relationships, does China try to exert undue influence on them?
I think every P5 country in some way, shape or form, and other large or influential UN members, we even can talk about Japan, for example, they do, of course, try to exert influence. They are interested in the world scene being moving how they would like it. But actually, these sometimes are not the most challenging parts of the UN system in terms of representation for smaller and less powerful countries. The more systemic issues, for example, are things like who's the head of the UN agency, how large are the delegations that go to different, that are in different climate in negotiations, for example, climate change. Larger countries tend to have much larger delegations. Smaller countries don't. They get exhausted by the end of it. And similarly, in New York, you have much smaller delegations for smaller countries. So these sorts of ways of exerting influence are not so obvious, perhaps, but at the same time, they do make a big difference.
Just finally, Hannah, do you think that the United Nations needs to be reformed, or does it need to be scrapped altogether?
the UN should definitely not be scrapped. However, this is at 80 years old, and this was a whole point of the work this year from the Secretary General, is that it really does need to be rethought and reimagined. If we think about the fact that the UN is headquartered in New York, there is no significant reason why it should be and why that should be the case. African countries, for example, make up something like 6% of all headquarters of UN agencies. Why is that the case when Africa obviously is a major focus for many of the UN agencies and also has 17% of the world's population? So some of these fundamental questions, where is the Secretary General from? How do we make sure that the staff of the UN is really diversified? How do we rethink even the Security Council? In my own view, for example, expanding the Security Council permanent membership isn't necessarily the best way to go. My colleagues and I have written about this. We do think maybe one option is actually to scrap permanent membership and have non-permanent membership consistently, but countries effectively race to the top and make a case for themselves to be at the head in the P5 or whatever the Security Council format is. So there are lots of different options on the table for the UN.
Hannah Ryder, thanks so much for your contributions today. Much appreciated. Well, the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has outlined the problems facing the United Nations and exactly what it lacks.
We have no carrots and no sticks in a world in which we have the geopolitical divides that we have. It's extremely difficult to make the protagonists of the present conflicts understand the need to come to peace. Now, the United States has carrots and sticks. So in some situations, if you are able to combine the two, I think we can have a very effective way to make sure that some peace process at least can lead to a successful result.
Let's bring in our next guest now, and Jennifer Cassidy is a former UN and EU diplomat. Jennifer, welcome to the programme. So Antonio Guterres, they're saying that unfortunately the United Nations has not the sticks nor the carrots to do its job properly. Do you think that the UN should be granted more powers, more tools in a way?
The primary principle or tool that should be given to the UN is reform of the Security Council. Because if reform of Security Council is to come about, and in essence, this means, in my opinion, as a political analysis, that is removing the veto power from the permanent 5 members. If we had a removal of this, that would enable the Security Council to actually have the power to pass legally binding resolutions which were voted upon by the General Assembly, that is the democratic voice of nations, and actually then implement legally binding laws and resolutions that the world has voted upon to end wars, to end famine, and to, what we're seeing at the moment, cease the violations of international law.
Jennifer, I understand that the United Nations is having to cut the budgets to some of its agencies. Is there a problem with funding?
Certainly, the UN is having a deep crisis of funding at the moment, particularly because the United States, that is actually the host country of the United Nations headquarters, has primarily been one of the greatest, we could say, quote unquote, investors of the United Nations, despite obviously throughout their foreign policy in the last number of decades being highly critical of it. But because of the current US administration, we've seen a complete reversal in the amount of funding being given to these agencies. And so what's it resulted is staff lost, policy lost, they're not meeting their goals and objectives. So yes, there's a huge financial and budgetary issues going on at the moment at the UN.
Jennifer, let's just take a look at the top funders now of the United Nations. And we have the United States at the top, then China, Japan, Germany, the UK, and the others. Do you think that the funding model has to change in order to make it more responsive, more democratic to more nations?
One way to perhaps make it more democratic regarding not only the input of funding, but therefore the reflection of that, what that funding would allow for to the democratic processes of all states is to perhaps create a model which is, somewhat reflective of what we see in other international organizations such as NATO. So with NATO countries, they're aiming for that all members of NATO should be putting in 2.5% of their national budget into NATO, and they're actually trying to increase this to 3%. So that is reflective of, what a country can give. It's not a certain number, it's reflective of what the country can give regarding their own economic position at the time, but it's also fair and transparent regarding what countries putting in. Now, if we had a system like that in the United Nations, that would allow for one, the reduction of power that these big spenders have and big investors have, nation states have over the UN and how it works, because this has clearly been an issue for decades. And then also the second point is we would see a more reflective and transparent use of the money for all countries and all conflicts that need addressing, because everyone will be putting in 2.5 or perhaps 3% of their national budget.
And just finally, Jennifer, do you think that the United Nations needs to be reformed, or do you think it needs to be scrapped altogether?
So fundamentally, no, the UN should not be scrapped. For all its flaws, it remains really the only true universal institution that we have as a global governance institution, where 193 states can sit together as equals, and where the principles of the UN Charter, that is sovereignty, non-use of force, human rights, all still provide an extremely solid and imperative framework for international order. And as in my view, as a political analysis, that it would be to scrap it would be to abandon actually the only global forum that we have. But with that said, the UN as it currently operates is really under immense strain, and with the political crises, and crises is a word and is an understated word at the moment that we're seeing globally, we have seen these flaws really become heightened. So the primary one here is the Security Council. As we know, it's dominated by the P5 members, and this no longer reflects today's world, but instead really reflects the geopolitics of 1945. So the veto allows, as we know, one or two states, which we've seen with the Israel-Gaza, one state to hijack the Security Council and the entire United Nations agenda and block any action for, an undetermined amount of time. So the choice between, not scrapping the UN or doing nothing is really a choice between defending the UN Charter and really then modernizing its institutions to make them more credible and really more reflective of the current geopolitical order that we now live in.
Jennifer Cassidy, thanks so much for your contributions to the Nexus today. Much appreciated. Well, with dozens of global leaders gathering in one place, it's inevitable there will be some unexpected, some might say bizarre moments. Here are some of the more memorable ones from recent years.
All I got from the United Nations was an escalator that on the way up stopped right in the middle, and then a teleprompter that didn't work. These are the two things I got from the United Nations. Whoever's operating this teleprompter is in big trouble.
How are you? Guess what? I'm waiting in the street because everything is frozen for you. Now I have 10 people with me. I go to the French embassy.
No. I'm sorry, President. I'm really sorry. It's just that everything's in frozen right now. There's a motorcade coming right. That's why.
Oh, sorry. If you don't see it, let me cross. I negotiate with you.
No, it's not that.
Well, we spoke to Ryan Heath, Politico's former global correspondent, and he told us some of the more unusual moments he saw behind the scenes while covering the United Nations.
The UN is always an extremely stressful time for New Yorkers. They cannot move around their own city. You have 100 or more world leaders in their motorcades clogging up the traffic. But it brings some beautiful serendipity too at the same time. There are not many other places where you can end up in the line for the bathroom with French President Emmanuel Macron. I found that in 2019. I also was literally running across the street one time with a coffee in hand, late to meet someone from the United Arab Emirates. And literally bumped into Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand. So those are the sort of things that are not going to happen if you're hanging around Washington, D.C. or hanging out in your hometown. These are things that only happen in New York during the UN General Assembly week. And one thing a lot of folks who haven't experienced the UN General Assembly might not realize is most of the events actually happen outside UN headquarters. So you have people crisscrossing around town doing a range of different side events. It might be a partnership between a corporation and a nonprofit. It is people who are trying to develop their industries and make sure that they align with the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. And one of the funniest stories I have is I turned up late to a lunch. I think this was in 2021 or 2022. And I rushed over to the coffee stand, and it was about the diamond industry and how to move beyond blood diamonds to put better traceability into the supply chains, a very sort of serious-minded event. And I was just chatting away with the folks at the coffee pot and thought I would impress them with my knowledge of Botswana, which was one of the focal points of the event. And it was only after I got through my really, really lame anecdote that it turned out I was speaking to the foreign minister of Botswana, the industry minister of Botswana, the ambassador to the United Nations from Botswana, and one of their wives. And that was just a moment where you wanted to just absolutely sink into the background and under the carpet, where you should learn that you could meet anyone when it's UN General Assembly week.
That was Ryan Heath there, sharing his experience, and that is all from the Nexus. Until next week then, goodbye.